Our first inductee is George Donley. I always like to call George the old left-hander. He was the first voice of the Cougars, calling games on KVGB in 1970. He continued in that role for 17 years. He retired from broadcasting in 1987 as the voice of the Cougars. During that time, George called the games as the young program quickly developed into a perennial conference contender. He began his broadcasting career as the voice of the Central Missouri State Mules in 1960, and he stayed in sports broadcasting for 29 years. He was one of the first announcers in the area to broadcast the women's basketball games as well as the men's games. Back in 1986, 1987, it was unheard of to broadcast girls' basketball games on the radio, let alone put them on a 100,000-watt FM station that you could hear from Hutchinson to Hayes to Ness City all the way to McPherson. No one wanted to waste their time on women's basketball, but George did that at the time when no one else was even putting them on small nighttime signals of games that you couldn't hear outside the city limits. George was I'll get to that in a moment. I want to say Hod Humston Award winners given by the Kansas Association of Broadcasters. He won that in 1988. Given to a Kansas broadcaster who's made a significant contribution to the field of sports broadcasting. George unfortunately passed from us in 1997, and he will be recognized today by his wife Sandra. He'll be presented here in a moment by Dana Foss, but I did want to say some comments because with George Donley, I started my broadcast career as the voice of the Pratt Beavers down at the Beaver Dome. And I'd always see George at the game, and I was always respectful to him. But he handpicked me to come to Great Bend in 1987 to take over for him. And he'd been doing the games for 17 years, and it always meant a lot to me, and it was a big boost in my career to come here and get a chance to do some winning basketball games with some great programs. I got to go to a national tournament with Jerry McCarty to Senatobia, Mississippi. Remember when he got lost, Deb? We still almost couldn't find our way down there. For George to handpick me to represent him was very important. And I don't know if George would want me to say this or not. George was a character. We had Jerry Mullen on a radio station yesterday morning, and he summed it up by saying George was just flat out a homer. He wore his support for the Cougars on his sleeve. He was a big supporter not only of the team, but he rooted for the student athletes as well. And even after they left Barton, that's what made George so special, because he cared so much. And he was Mr. Barton Community College as far as I was concerned, and he wasn't an instructor here or an athlete or anything like that, but he was its biggest booster. And with some more comments on George, Dana Foss knew George very closely, and Dana, come on up. Dana Foss.
Thank you, Steve, and congratulations to your other Hall of Fame inductees and to your families. I would like to give you a little insight on our first Hall of Fame inductee today, George Donley. Down a little bit? Thank you. I began working at the athletic department in 1975, and of course at that time George was the voice of the Cougars and had been for quite a while. My office was in the lower level of the gymnasium, and you had to go through my office in order to get to the athletic director's offices, and at that time most of the athletic directors were also the men's or women's basketball coach. George would always come in, and he'd go right back to the athletic director's office, and I would sit there very nicely, and all of a sudden they'd get up and close the door. And that was my clue to turn my radio on, extremely loud. And I don't ever think that there were any fisticuffs going on, but I think there were big, high-level discussions. The thing that I thought was remarkable was when they opened their door, George always asked me what I thought and included me in the conversations. And that was the type of man George was. He never met a stranger, and he always made you feel important in what you said or what you did. To say that George impacted everyone he met is such a true statement. When Sandra asked me to say a few words about George, I was flattered. But I realized the George I knew had a very different working relationship with the coaches that he worked so closely with over the years. And during each of their seasons and through those years, they all included George, went through, and all that George went through would be what I refer to as the good, the bad, and the ugly, and not necessarily in that order. In order for me to give the true picture of George and his working and personal relationship with the coaches, I was in contact with some of the previous coaches. I knew that George had worked with him in a different and closer way than I did, and some of the things they told me will give you a true insight into the voice of the Cougars for 18 years. Lauren Miller came here as men's basketball coach in 1976 and through 1979. He followed Dick Nagy, the original men's basketball coach at Barton, and came at a time that the community really didn't want Dick Nagy to leave, and George and Dick had a very close relationship. Lauren said that when he came to Barton, he wasn't quite sure if he would get any kind of a good reception or not. He had heard that George really was the first person he was going to meet, and someone had said George could be a little distant until he got to know you, you won a couple of games, or he decided you were okay. Contrary to that, he went to Red Wing with George, and I don't know if a lot of you remember Red Wing, but he went to Red Wing with George, and he was so gracious and so supportive, and to his credit, mentioned his loyalty to Dick Nagy. I gave him the title of the Western Wind, and he liked it. He asked me once, when you refer to me with that title, what are you thinking? My response, never at a loss for words, and without question, you can make an average game exciting and an average coach think he or she is great. I had a radio show with George every week that lasted 30 minutes. He was so skilled at taking that time to focus on things other than strategy. It was all about life's great moments and life's not so great moments. That radio show that was 30 years ago impacted my life to this day. The questions requires the truth, no X's and O's, and that was George at his best. Jerry Mullen was here from 1979 to 85. There are two incidents that I recall with George. One was we had just lost a very close game on a desperation shot with New Mexico Junior College. And those of you who know Jerry can believe this. He went nuts. And he's storming around there. And since I was privileged to work with Jerry, I remember the storming around. And George motioned to him, come on up to the press box. And Jerry said, no way, no way. And George said, I got your back. And he always covered the coaches. Also, there was another incident when they were on the road to Moberly, never an easy place to play. After we had lost our fourth consecutive game and had faced lots of adversity, I was out talking to another coach when I heard George in our locker room dressing down the players one by one. I stepped in and never said a word, as I couldn't have done it any better. This was the turning point in our season. As we went on to win the conference, George felt the agony of defeat and the fulfillment of victory as a member of the team. Never has been then another one like him. Dan McGovern was here from 1986 to 1994. I believe if you would look up the word enthusiasm in the dictionary, you might see a picture of George Donley. Of all the memories I have of George, of all the vivid, clear pictures I have of him in my mind, whether it's George at a Booster Club meeting, in town having coffee, in the press box, or in line to get a hot dog, in each one of them, he was smiling. I remember a January road trip. We had just finished a late game at Dodge City It was colder than heck. I was on the warm bus waiting. Here comes George, walking through the snow up to his knees, 40-mile-an-hour wind smacking his face, one hand holding the briefcase, the other clutching his hat, and he was walking with a smile on his face. As an announcer, George was in a class all by himself. George loved the Cougars. He always carved out time to sit down and speak with players on the teams. The players could tell George cared about him. Whenever you listened to his golden pipes on the radio, you could easily picture everything he was describing. He managed to make the game a little more exciting than it was. But what could you expect from a gifted announcer with a smile on his face? And from the women's basketball side, Jerry McCarty also served as athletic director for a few years and basketball coach. He said that George was not only a great announcer, but the perfect fan and supporter. No matter how the Lady Cougars were doing, George was always very positive and always asked, "Is there anything I can do?" and never showed any partiality between the women's and men's team. From the AD side, George was the first person from the radio station, which was KBGB and still is, to bring them in to the Booster Club. And he brought George in the Booster Club as a Top Cat member, which at that time was the very highest top award or category in the Booster Club. That began a long association with Barton Athletics, and the community with KBGB, and a great deal of that is because of George. So now you know a little bit more about the person that's being inducted into the 2011 Hall of Fame today. Some of you may have known George, been in a group with him, or listened to him on the radio and thought, hey, he's a pretty good guy, and he does a good job. He was more than a pretty good guy, and he did a great job. He was a vital part of the community, the Booster Club, and above all, Barton Athletics.
Oh my goodness, it just seems like it was only yesterday that I was here. I mean, really, you know, I see a lot of people that I taught with, and I see a lot of people that I screamed at basketball games with, and I see a lot of just wonderful, wonderful friends. And I'm just so pleased to be here tonight. My husband and I made this trip yesterday. It took us 9.5 hours to get from Hot Springs Village, Arkansas. And we brought 2 sets of clothes, hot clothes for when we go home, cold clothes for while we're here. I should just turn that around, I think. Warm clothes for while we're here, cool clothes for when we go home. And this is just such a wonderful treat and such a wonderful, wonderful honor. I cannot tell you how grateful I am for this honor that you have given and bestowed upon George. He would be just, well, you know how he would be. He would be just so happy. And so anyway, I just want to thank all of you and tell you that I don't have the words to properly thank you, but just seeing you again, so many of you, is just more than I can even imagine. Thank you so much.